Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 183, and I'd like to say a big welcome onto the podcast to Brian Mackenzie. Brian, how are you?
Good. How you doing, Ben? Thanks for having me.
No problem. I really appreciate you coming on. I've just been saying just before we started recording, I've listened to you on a number of podcasts now. I've got to say podcasts much bigger than this one, but really love the work that you put out there, and I'm really keen to dive into some of it on this episode. So, Brian, I know this is the golden question, but some of our listeners might have heard of your work, some may not. Can you give a little bit of a breakdown on what you do?
The simple explanation is I do biological engineering. I do not like to use technologies at all, although I use them for data collection. I am primarily invested in the human experience as it is from a biological perspective. That began in human performance and having a fascination with performance, and it's steered me towards a lot of different modalities and ways to manipulate the human experience. Namely, at the foundation of that currently is breath control. And we've uncovered a number of things with breath control that seem to be some of the most pivotal changes that we've been able to create in performance and the human experience at large. That said, I don't think I could retrain a wild animal's breathing pattern. So that would apply to the human experience if we were still wild. But nonetheless, we are not. And so I have a pretty interesting job. More or less, I work around stress and manipulating stress in order to create an adaptive process, which is more or less what anybody in exercise science, sports sciences, et cetera, are really doing. I'm just taking a simpler approach to it, and we use breath control at the foundation of it all.
Awesome. And that's something that we're obviously going to dive into today, because I think breath work and breathing techniques are probably something that a lot of practitioners listening have heard of. Whether they utilize them and utilize them in the right way is probably a different discussion. So we will get into that. I'm keen to dive into that. But just first of all, where did this interest, this passion of yours come from?
I'm a curious person by nature. I am driven by curiosity and learning. And I challenged somebody who handed me a resistance breathing device, a training mask. They gave it to me and it said elevation training mask on it. And I've studied altitude and hypoxia for about 15 years. Like, I've really looked into it at a high depth, and I've created some IP around development for things with that stuff. But for some reason, breath control escaped that process in the first 5 to 7 years. I was using machines, etc., to manipulate, or altitudes or oxygen scrubbers to screw with things. But when somebody handed me this device, it said elevation training mask, I kind of laughed and was like, this can't change pressure. It doesn't change barometric pressure. We're not seeing changes in atmospheric pressure and barometric pressure, even though it's creating more pressure when we breathe in. I didn't make the connection, but I knew that I hadn't used the device, so I put it on anyway. And when I put it on, when I drew a breath, I sat up and organized myself. And it was due to that resistance and that pressure from a mechanical standpoint, which most of us can understand in exercise physiology, that when you apply resistance to something, you'll get more or less better engagement to something, right? So I instantly organized my spine when I did this in a very different way. And I took a very coordinated breath. And it flipped my lid because I now knew I had a device that I could give to athletes that were global that I was working with to get them to organize themselves better when we were warming up or doing things just to train, right? So I was like, oh, wow. Then that took me down the rabbit hole of breathing. But it began with mechanics because my background came from movement and mechanics. And so I had a very formal understanding in running mechanics, et cetera. And that was basically what I had done. I've got 2 books on endurance training, et cetera. One of them, a New York Times bestseller called Unbreakable Runner. And all of this stuff was like in my wheelhouse, but like, it just shattered my brain that like I hadn't thought about this. So I wanted to learn more. And I started studying the physiology on respiratory physiology. And then I started looking into neurobiology because breathing starts in the brain. And, you know, the whole thing just led to me uncovering a lot of things that nobody was talking about. Nobody was doing. In fact, there still is nobody really looking at this stuff in the way that we are currently, which is very, very odd to me because of what we're seeing. You know, and we're sharing that publicly, but it's a very interesting world. Nonetheless, the resistance breathing device kind of fell off because we found out that we had our own biological resistance breathing device with us at all times, and it's called our nose. And athletes, even the best athletes in the world, aren't using it appropriately. And that's not to say that everything is nasal breathing, but it is part of the fundamentals of breathing. And it's a lost art, as James Nestor's book, Breathe, talks about. You know, it's a fundamental lost art. And there's a reason why it's a fundamental lost art, and it's called civilization. And indigenous cultures didn't lose this. They held on to this, you know, art. Nonetheless, that was where it began and why it began. And I took some rather deep dives into the entirety of how breathing works, and really came to some very interesting observations that have been talked about in things like yoga for thousands of years, but have been poo-pooed or ignored within inside the human performance world, which is radical because I was one of those people who poo-pooed, but now I'm like, oh shit, like these guys were right, like about what they were talking about. And brilliant. It's just, the applications are very similar, although it's different in certain respects, because when we're talking about things like football, it's, you know, it's a high metabolic demand effort that's going into this, high skill. All of these things come, but all of these things are actually a part of things in what yoga originally meant, you know, which was to come together, to unify something, to understand with the highest moral code. It wasn't about getting flexible. It had nothing to do with that. But nonetheless, that was why all of this stuff kind of came to fruition and how it came to fruition.
Now, I want to deal with the skeptics out there, Brian, because I imagine there's a few that are like, I breathe, my players breathe. Why do I need to focus on this? I do it all the time. Well, let's dive into that, because I know you've got loads of great information on the benefits and some protocols that we could potentially go into as well. What would you say to someone that's got someone with that opinion to start with?
I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and you know, there is no right or wrong way. There's what are you learning? But that sort of a response already tells me where somebody's at, which means they believe they're an expert, which means that they have nowhere to go. I'm still learning about a lot of this, but what I do understand, and we've actually shared this publicly with professional athletes, that we've tested on metabolic carts, that there is a big difference in what you want to accomplish metabolically. And if you think you understand that without applying any sort of breath control or any sort of better breathing strategies to that, you're behind the curve at this point. So by all means, people can poo-poo all they want, but I can guarantee you with the conversations that we're having and where we're having them, people are going to get left behind. And then they're going to be coming up in the rear going, oh shit, like this does have an impact. I mean, there's a reason why the oldest movement practice in the world has it at its foundation. It's very simple to understand in terms of if you understand how energy works, how we work metabolically, you have to understand, like if you have not taken a look at respiratory physiology as a result of that, you're missing the big component, because that is in the first basic response to any sort of stressor, whether that be physical, emotional, or psychological, etc. Right? So we respond to our environment physically and emotionally. And for the first time in our history, probably in the last 100 years or so, as it's gotten worse, we are at a loss emotionally, meaning our emotional intelligence hasn't really changed much or evolved. And our breathing patterns respond to emotion instantaneously. So meaning, if I'm an angry, sad, frustrated, whatever person that deals with emotions on a long-term basis, meaning I'm just pissed off at society or pissed off the way things are going on, or take that to anything you want, you can bet there's a breathing pattern that's following that. And that's usually comes with, societally, what I'm talking about is more or less people talk a lot more than they need to. And that comes with a metabolic cost. So if I've spoken a little bit too long right now, my arousal state goes up. There's a metabolic consequence as a result of that, good or bad or indifferent. So I have a metabolic shift that occurs as a result of me breathing the way I am with my mouth open and speaking. And rightfully so. I should be driving attention towards you and what we're talking about, right? So at any rate, just to wrap that question up into this, is it's like people, like I have studied this so far into the well. We have looked at this so deep into the well that I can correlate it to behavior and responses from people and how they interact with us and telling me what's right or what's wrong. And it's not about what's right or what's wrong. Here's what we understand so far. And there's a mountain of anecdotal evidence about this.
Yeah.
Not for me, from other experts. So
yeah. No, it's a great point. I want to start in a place, because I know with football and a lot of other sports, there's certain cultures and involved, and there's certain areas that we know that we can impact maybe quicker than others. And I think one easy way to start, or one good way of start, is the recovery side, and how we can maybe implement stuff in recovery, because players are receptive to it. Coaches are receptive to it, and it just seems to be an area that players might, in my opinion, they might look into it a little bit more initially before we start talking about other areas. So with that in mind, in terms of recovery for players, what are some strategies possibly that we can use? And then we can maybe dive into some specifics like cold exposure and things like that.
Yeah. First and foremost, the nervous system is pretty much at the foundation of response to recovery, right? And I think we all can pretty much agree on that. It's why we use HRV. It's why we look at central nervous system development. It's why all of these systems, the technologies we're looking at, literally tap into what's going on from a nervous system standpoint. The easiest way to grab a hold of one's nervous system is through our breathing. The fastest way is through the visual system. And so, so I have one of my close friends is he's a neuroscientist with an ophthalmology background, Dr. Andrew Huberman. And so his focus has been around vision his entire career. And we've talked extensively about this. We became friends because he contracted me to come into his lab, develop protocols for some things around breathing. But because the eyes are a part of the brain, the visual system is taking in so much information, and the way we're taking it in, it's the fastest way to learn how to do something would be through the visual system. But the easiest way is breathing, because we can actually grab a hold of our breathing in any situation, right? And it becomes harder to work with the visual system unless we actually have trained that extensively. So meaning if I'm somebody who's a footballer and I'm in a stadium, the easiest way to recover in any way, shape, or form is to look at the furthest point in that stadium and drop into more of a panoramic vision to where we're allowing ourselves, think of a sunset, right? Like, who freaks out looking at the sunset? Nobody. Why? It's not because their head's telling them, it's because you've literally sent a signal to shift down, right? So using that is one strategy, but I think the most important one is actually developing a breathing strategy that we've seen is the fastest way to get the nervous system to drop out. Sometimes in very heightened arousal states, meaning when we're under large metabolic load, stress, or high motion, panics type situations, we can start with some mouth breathing where it's intentional to offload carbon dioxide so that we can actually create a calming or a relieved feeling. So unfortunately, when there's an emotional panic situation and there's no metabolic cost for that, that doesn't really come very easily. Okay. And that's important to understand and differentiate. All right. There's a reason why people handed people paper bags when they were having panic attacks and not telling them to hyperventilate. Because if there's no metabolic need to offload that much carbon dioxide, you're flipping the pH a little bit to an alkaline situation, which is only constricting the blood vessels to the brain and making you hypoxic in the brain quickly, which is sending you into a higher sympathetic output. But if there is, however, metabolic demand, so think of lifting weights, sprints at maximal output, etc., the easiest, fastest way is to intentionally use what we will call a gear 5. So think of 5 gears in a car, all right? And gear 5 is mouth-only breathing. And so that becomes and the moment we can feel a minor switch or a drop is when we can flip into a nose, mouth. Then when we can feel a switch from that, we can drop into nose. And the sooner I get to calm, relaxed, nasal-only breathing, the faster my nervous system has dropped out and responded. And the easiest way we know how to do that is by almost double timing the exhale to the inhale.
Okay.
Right? So that's a gear down from 5 to 4 to actually getting you to a 1. 3, 2, and 1 are all nasal. 3 would be a, 2 would be a, and then 1 calm nasal breathing, or equal in and out. So it's fairly simple in what we've developed in just using a gearing strategy, but that becomes for recovery. What we typically use for recovery and letting people know that they're recovered is using anywhere in the vicinity of a 1 breath cycle, meaning inhale and exhale, 1 breath cycle in 5 to 7 seconds. And that typical pattern, you've got somebody who's regulated and ready to go again. That can become, you can get really good at that and still have high output. And that means like I can function above a 140 heart rate with 1 breath every 7 seconds or so. So now when I started doing all of this, that was not the case. And there are plenty of athletes we've worked with, and, you know, even non-professional athletes we've worked with who've developed a high enough tolerance, CO2 tolerance, where they can handle that. But they feel ready to go at those levels, even at higher heart rates, which tells us that heart rate really is not the indicator of things that we thought it once was.
Yeah, I've dabbled with this stuff a little bit, and it's when you say that, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that sounds okay, 5 to 7 seconds, and that's that breathing pattern and changing of gears. It's not.
Yeah.
Like this
Yeah.
stuff needs practicing, doesn't it? Like any sort of skill, this needs working on.
Yeah, it does. But once that skill is developed, look, once motor control, once you've been able to hardwire, that becomes a pattern, because it's why I can get on a bike now at, you know, like roughly 275 to 300 watts for a longer effort. And I prefer nasal breathing at that level over mouth breathing. Meaning if I were to mouth breathe at that wattage, what happens is we start to see a shift in energy up into more anaerobic activity quicker. And I become more stressed. So I can actually feel the tension start to happen at those levels. Now, that doesn't mean at higher outputs than that, mouth breathing or that gear 5 doesn't come into play. It most certainly does. But through development of better aerobic function, higher aerobic function, we see like, holy crap, like I don't want to be breathing like that right here, because it's actually draining. It's costing more money. We start to understand the cost of ATP.
When we start relating this stuff to VO2 max or how strong we are, and that's why we're pushing boundaries on that stuff, is to get more efficient. If we relate that to this, it becomes obvious, doesn't it?
Yes. And that's the thing, is it's like, and that's the first thing we start to see. I mean, I can see a VO2 max change in somebody in less than 4 weeks in just a very simple nasal breathing development program, not even allowing them to reach maximal outputs, because we're actually training them how to breathe better, right? So they're actually developing a bigger cage, so the lung capacity is developing, and they're also not allowing the limit of, so they're not going beyond the limit of where they're aerobically, like truly aerobically efficient at, right? Like once you start to get into that gear 3, you're becoming anaerobic, and like you're becoming more anaerobic, and it becomes uncomfortable. So you feel the need to start to flip to bigger breathing patterns, like, or, right? And when we don't allow that, you're forcing that nose to actually dig deeper, and the byproduct of metabolism, which becomes that Bohr effect, which is that switch, that ability to tolerate the acidity in the blood with CO2 and O2, you're starting to use more of that oxygen at those higher levels. And so you're actually retraining the system. So that then when we go to test, like maximally, it's like there's a whole nother gear above where these people thought they could land. And case in point was one of the early, CrossFitters I was working with at the games level, right? He came to me, he was an Aussie kid, and he came to me, and I had him on a month of just development of nasal breathing with his endurance work. He couldn't get up to a 140 heart rate nasal only breathing on an assault bike. At the end of 4 weeks, he was at 170 heart rate, and he said he felt like he could go forever, just nasal breathing. We didn't even touch the mouth breathing yet. So it was like, oh, and he was like, dude, I'm sold. Like, what else do we need to do? And it's like, okay, here we go.
With people going through those change of gears from mouth breathing to nasal and mouth and then to nasal, is that like a natural progression for everyone? Does everyone end up nasal breathing at the end of it, if that makes sense? Or does some people not get to that point and it needs training for them to even achieve nasal only breathing?
From a general population standpoint, yes, it does. On the latter part of that question, it's going to take a lot of retraining. But with the populations we're largely dealing with, in terms of performance, no, it becomes second nature, because it's what you feel like. The whole idea here, and this is why I preface what I do as a biological engineer here, is like, you start to pay attention to what the fuck's going on with your body, not metrics that are outside of you that mean nothing. Those are byproducts of you getting dialed in here. And I dial it in here before we even start to look at those outside metrics. But those outside metrics will reflect what's going on internally. And so we train people from the physiological side, not from the psychological side necessarily, right? I don't let people, we get their attention focused on themselves, not on outside of them. And so that inevitably leads somebody to, any performance junkie is going to see those numbers change if they're invested in the actual time to make the changes.
Brilliant. And then just an expansion on the recovery topic.
Yes.
That was great in terms of in a game situation, in a training situation. I think there's already stuff that practitioners can start thinking about to get players to focus on in terms of recovery during that session or that game. What about post? So when the game's finished, we're wanting players to now recover for the next day of training or the next game. What about some approaches or protocols to use there?
Yeah, this kind of gets into the, a lot of people, you need to find out what works for you. But, this has been the big kind of one of the interesting plays that the new breathing community, as there is this new community that's developed. And I guess I'm a part of that, but nonetheless, it's these blanket protocols that work for everybody. There's no such thing, just so we're clear. And we started seeing that pretty early on, is people respond to patterns, breathing patterns, very differently because of how they handle stress. And certain patterns can have consequences to them that people spin off or become actually more charged from. A case in point are things like, Wim Hof method for somebody who deals with anxiety. You're quite literally inducing an anxious breathing pattern into yourself and exacerbating that stuff, even though there's people with anxiety who've used the Wim Hof method and have had some success with it. This isn't about the Wim Hof method. It's about understanding how physiology works, how stress physiology works, and how you interact with stress. I've seen people just totally freak out, like hyperventilating. And then I've seen people who've totally bottomed out and calmed down by using it, right? But one thing certain is that when we slow our breathing patterns down to to what we would call CO2 tolerance, to what your tolerance is, we tend to see a calming of the system in its entirety. So one of the easiest strategies you can use is something like a 3-count inhale followed by a double time or more exhale, and following that for 5 to 10 minutes. We have things that are set up for free off of our website at shiftadapt.com on starting a breath practice.
There's also a link in my bio on my Instagram account on starting breath practice where people can actually measure their exhale test and get an understanding of what that CO2 tolerance is so that they can correlate that to some patterns that might work for them in terms of timing to things. And that timing to things is important because, and here's the simple explanation of that. If I asked every one of your listeners to just stop and hold their breath right now, just take an inhale and hold, and I ran a clock for 30 seconds, you'd have a bunch of different breath hold times, right? And that's easy for people to understand like that. Your respiration rate's the same thing, man. Everybody's respiration rate does not sit in the same spot because it's constantly changing due to the amount of information we're taking in, processing, the work demand or metabolic demand that's going on, right? All of these things are at play. And so it's a constant fluctuation. So getting an understanding where your baseline's at in a calm place can give you a good understanding of what to do. So a good recovery strategy for post-game or post-training session is to find a breathing rhythm that works for you and spending 5 to 10 minutes afterwards just going through that pattern. That'll drop you out. Making sure you don't jump on your phone or in front of the screen is one of the most important things you can do if you actually want to recover, because that is telling that that is telling your brain to turn back on, and you're trying to switch down. And so this is where the conundrum of technology, et cetera, starts to fall into place. Is a lot of people, a lot of athletes, and I watch them all the time, go right to their phone as soon as they're done training. And it's like, dude, like that's got to be the last thing you do or do that. Like you've really got to be, thinking about this differently and what you really care about. And it's not on that phone. I can guarantee it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's probably, like you say, that's common across not just sports, men and women, is it? That's just common across society as a whole, that we reach for those devices too easily.
Yeah. You know, I mean, the thing is like in the performance world, what we're dealing with, there's such an opportunity for these people to actually learn about their physiology, not from a academic standpoint, but from a deep interoceptive standpoint that becomes such a catalyst for deep work towards one's own self-healing and self-understanding. But it's literally being demolished because of the need, like our attachments and false beliefs towards the need to win or the need to be better than somebody else, the comparative narrative, versus really truly just going and learning and understanding your own physical body. And that becomes a driver for people to improve. I don't think we're anywhere even close to expressing our biological potential. And I think we've actually gone in reverse in a lot of cases, even though we think based on where we're at from the professional standpoint, how things have improved. I would argue that technology has interrupted that in so many capacities, and we don't understand it. And there's a very unique situation that occurred a couple Olympics back with a sprinter who actually went and dressed up and competed prior to the Olympics in the way that Jesse Owens did, meaning he dressed, wore the same shoes, had the same starting block, meaning he had to dig his own holes, and he was on a cinder track. And this is a guy who runs a second or more faster, I think, than Jesse Owens' record, right? And he ran a second slower than Jesse Owens did, right? And so what we're not connecting, we're giving ourselves an illusion based on all the fancy shit that's around us. And we're buffering ourselves from that to truly understand where we are at biologically. And I am wholeheartedly under the impression that there's so much more opportunity in this, especially from the physical and performance standpoint, to learn about oneself and when one is off. Like, an athlete knows when they're off, but unfortunately that's becoming an exacerbation of like dysfunction because they're comparing themselves to somebody else, or because they can't win something, or because they're not getting a contract for something. They're totally like getting off basis with the whole thing and creating a traumatic experience out of it. And then when a career is over, they can't separate themselves from that. So sorry to take you down the philosophical approach to that, but this is the reality that we're dealing with inside professional sports at a global level. And I'm seeing it in every sport that I deal with. And I've dealt with, I don't know, like a dozen or more different sports at this point. And it's the same thing, you know, from strictly strength to endurance to things like football or even hockey and professional, you know, NFL, whatever. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it just got me thinking when you're talking about the whole process post game, and there's a lot of aspects that players have to deal with in that time where it's very emotional, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. With depending on the level, media commitments, then you've got discussions with coaches, there might be discussions or arguments with teammates and all the rest of it. I was trying to think, like, what would be the optimal really if we were trying, and I know it depends person to person, but if we were to try and really focus on recovery in that time, I guess the best way would be to take someone back to their breath and have a period of reflection on the game, wouldn't it? And let them reflect on it and sort of sit or just
100%, so that game is not something that's thought about the next game. It's something that we've actually processed and been able to move on to and learn from. And here's what we're applying. That's a relationship. Like there's no difference in how one would with a spouse or with a, you know, whatever. This is the same thing, but we're not doing this, unfortunately.
Well, that if we take that, because I know a lot of coaches will be like, okay, that's great, but we can't do that because there's a lot of other factors that come into play. There's definitely a halfway point in there somewhere, isn't there? That, okay, that's if we take that as ideal, what's a little bit less than ideal, but still gives us that aspect that players can reflect and get this sort of work in. And I'm not expecting an answer from you, but I think that's a discussion that has to be had, isn't it? That needs to be taken into consideration.
Certainly. I mean, certainly. I work with a lot of people, guide a lot of people who I have to meet halfway. And, you know, it's an interesting process because it's not until you go all the way in that you're going to actually truly understand. And, you know, so you have to actually sit there and still work with somebody to guide them towards almost coming to their own conclusion. The study of Zen has been this is the whole point of Zen, right? The whole point of Zen is for a Zen master to expose the student to himself or herself so that they stop torturing themselves and see the big picture, and that happiness actually is, and it's not something you can achieve. And that's the state that we all want to exist in. Yet as a society and culture, even in football, we're chasing this. We have to win in order to be happy. No, that's not, there couldn't be anything more incorrect about that. Winning can be a byproduct of the understanding of becoming happy, being happy, right? Nonetheless, if I don't have equilibrium, inside, or homeostasis with inside the organization, it's going to be dysfunctional. And so now I can have a winning team that's highly dysfunctional. Great. Like, what does that mean? You know, like, it's a destructive process, but nonetheless, there is a place to meet people, as long as we're kind of still guiding people towards this understanding of self, right? And how to manage and work with people in a way that you're seeing a lot of organizations move towards, like Oak, like they really are looking towards moving towards things like this. You have organizations or even companies like something like a great example of something like Patagonia. Like, it's all about stuff like this, right? Like, and there's no reason why being at the top can't mean taking care of oneself at the foundation.
So how does that look for the company? Does that mean adding in some breathwork practice throughout the day at times of reflection, and then are they measuring it against productivity? Like, what's that look like for the company?
I actually think it's education.
Okay.
To be honest, it's education with inside the organization.
Yeah.
And what that actually means. And breath just becomes a part of that. Like, I don't by any means think breath is the answer to all of this. And there's no amount of breath work that'll work that will that can, you know, take away the pain you're not willing to deal with. And unfortunately, that's where the breath movement has basically taken us, which we predicted was going to happen anyway. You know, people attach themselves to things very quickly because they don't want to feel or process what is really going on, which is why at the organizational standpoint, it can't just be about winning. Winning should be the byproduct of us actually understanding where the dysfunction is and how to work with that and make the actual organization a healthy ecosystem for everybody to be a part of, to where they can, shit, man, I'm going to go down regulate after this game, because that is because I know that's how I feel best, right? Like, I'm going to practice with intention, and if something's off, I'm going to bring that up and I'm going to make changes based on that. This is where something like breathing comes in, breathing strategies come in. Like, it's, hey, we are not going above a gear 4 today with this work effort we're creating, because we know that everybody's gear 4 is going to change based on where they are at from a physical standpoint. You can't be like, if I were to say, let's just say gear 1, let's just say we did some gear 1 training today. Like, everybody's going to do gear 1. Well, a lot of athletes are going to find out that their gear 1 today, they're not able to put out as much as they were yesterday or 3 days before. But nonetheless, that gear 1 stands. We're still getting the metabolic output that we were looking for, but they're not getting the work that they wanted. So the ego isn't getting its trip, right? And then we're not actually cooking the athlete in a way that is going to leave them needing more recovery than they did before. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Because then across a squad of players, then it's reasonably easy to periodize that session and get what you want out of it, isn't it? Even though everyone's different.
There you go. 100%.
Like what you said about before about the breath hold. I think that defines it really nicely, that you're not going to have everyone finishing at the same time. So it just shows.
And it's just like, oh, okay, so today everybody hold their breath. Why? How come everybody's breath hold changed? Because you're in a different place based on how well you've managed stress.
Yeah.
And so it just becomes a byproduct of how do we fine tune that for everybody. Not everybody's going to be in the same place at the same time, but we can get pretty close if we can create an ecosystem that that allows people to want to thrive and function in that ecosystem. Then we see the best. We truly start to see the best.
And again, when I was planning this, I was trying to think about, right, what are the easy areas to go at for coaches to utilize this work? Because we know that with coaches, it's not as easy as just dropping something new in and everyone taking to it straight away. So I was trying to think, like, recovery is definitely something that we can target. And then the other area I want you to maybe touch on is utilizing it with like mobility work or stretching.
Oh yeah.
Because this is something that players do all the time. Like, they know the benefits of doing their stretching, doing the mobility, but could this just be a really, really easy tweak that, okay, this is the time that we can now focus on it?
100%, but it can't replace the actual like if you're doing some stretching, etc., and tissue work, that's its own thing, but you can enhance that through breath manipulation for sure. And that'll help bring the athlete down or actually get them into this more parasympathetic dominant place for recovery. But you know, we're always trying to, you can't replace the actual downtime, right? You just can't, you know, and people don't understand that. They're trying to maximize all their time. It's like, no, it's really important that there's downtime and you're bored. And unfortunately, we can't be bored. So people go to the phone.
So true.
And it's like, dude, read a fucking book. Like, go outside, get some sun, man. Like, fuck. Like, every cell in that body is designed to take in what that sun is doing. And like, it helps with that process. Get your shoes off, for Christ's sakes. Like, step on grass with bare feet. Like, go walk around. Like, you can't replace this stuff with, you know, but you certainly can enhance that stretching and mobility time with breath control. And I think it's really important to take a look at something like yoga and where they applied these things into positional strategies. Like, why is it they exhale into flexion and inhale into extension? Where, like, getting into positions of restriction and breathing into those and not doing it with my mouth. Because if I go and open up here like this, I can breathe real easy, right? But if oh shit, there's a lot of restriction there. Like, that's different breathing through my nose. And there's a big reason, because I'm forcing my diaphragm to actually come on and breathe horizontally in a very different way than breathing vertically and getting away with chest breathing and shoulder breathing here, right? So I can start to teach people what opening up and getting back to normal really means. And, you know, like Kelly Starrett from the Ready Skate has done a fantastic job with all of that. I mean, there was, you know, he and I grew up together, and he was the only one speaking a language that was like, I was like, oh my God, nobody's talking about things like this. And it was like, he's like, dude, what you're talking about, nobody, you know, it's like, we just kept going at it and working around these subjects. And it's like, dude, it's fundamental across the boards and how this gets applied, right? And there's no reason why breath control shouldn't be at the foundation of everything we're doing with inside training. It's just learning how to apply that. And that's where my job actually has to come in, is where people have to bring me in for consultation, because it's like, here's where we can insert it, here's where we can insert it. I'm not there to restructure your program or programs per se. I'm there to show you how to implement these strategies and where they can actually create the biggest bang for your buck inside an organization.
Yeah, that's the great point. And that's what I was trying to get at, is that there's definitely low hanging fruit, isn't there? There's areas that we can,
you know, and people are smart enough, but I mean, it's also like, we're not intelligent enough in certain aspects because we get so fixated on such little things. Then we think breathing becomes the thing, but it's like, no, breathing's just the foundation of this. Where can we apply it and understand it? And then where can we start to see the holes in our organization as a result of it, right? And then you start to look at the athlete's training and you go, oh, like, this guy or gal is mouth breathing all the time on the pitch. Like, whoa, we've got there's definitely, like, I can tell you right now, there's a metabolic issue with that. That metabolic issue may just be a component of emotional or physical, but that's where the homework starts to begin, right? This is why we have sports psychs. This is why we have conditioning coaches, et cetera. This is why you have metabolic equipment. Like, what are we looking at here? Where is the disruption? Why is this athlete breathing like this all the time?
Everyone's going to be looking in that next game. They're going to be watching mouths, watching noses. And that's going to be me as well. I'm going to be all over it.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
it's interesting, man, because this really, like, the reason we clung to this was because it covers everything. Legitimately, we're able to see the entire behavioral orchestra of the biological experience by understanding ventilation, because ventilation is at the epicenter of what's going on through the entire experience, whether it's internal or external.
Brilliant. Brian, one last thing I wanted you to touch on, which I heard you talk about, I can't remember what podcast it was the link between sort of breath work and immune health.
Yeah.
And that, when you were talking about that, I was like, wow, because obviously with COVID and everything that's gone on recently, this should be like we should be paying more and more attention to this, but I'm not sure whether we are or people are or not. But can you give a little bit of information around that? Because I found that really fascinating.
Where, you want me to focus like the COVID thing, or you want me to just immune in general?
Yeah, I think in general.
Okay. So the immune system in general is, it's unfortunately, we have immune system dysfunction at large because we're more of a sympathetically dominant culture globally, not just the US and the UK. This is a global thing, right? And I think we all can agree on that. So if I'm in a more heightened sympathetic state, what does that mean from a like a neuroendocrine response, sort of, even like if we were to include neuroimmune endocrinology, which is now a new study, right? This would mean we're seeing, and I'm not the expert here, but I've looked into this stuff enough to see what it means. Immune systems respond to things and should come down, right? Like, the immune system shouldn't be in a heightened state, meaning adrenaline is an immune system booster, right? So if we're in a constant state of an immune system at a heightened arousal state, you're going to see that when somebody finally comes off that, or finally relaxes enough, that they'll get a cold, or they'll get sick, right? I can't tell you how many times I've listened to a podcast on like a Joe Rogan, or like one of the top podcasts, and they've got some, high expert on who's talking about how they went on vacation, or how every time they go on vacation or something, after about 2 or 3 days, they get sick. And I instantly am like, yeah, that's because you're finally coming off that heightened arousal state.
It's so true that
we're not in a regulated state. So just the general idea around this is that our sympathetic, parasympathetic systems should be evolved. It should be flowing out all day, right? Like when somebody comes to a practice, even a coach, it's on time. So I come into a heightened arousal state because I'm cueing into what's going on, or I'm putting out as to what's going on in a practice, right? So my immune system comes back on. I need to come off of that. And that's the importance of recovery, so that things can fix and make the changes that are necessary from an endocrine system standpoint, so that we come back into an anabolic state, a growth state, right? Not just this catabolic state. So using breath to actually regulate that allows us to grab a hold of an immune system and allow that immune system to come off that heightened state in the right periods of time. We're not doing that enough. This just adds to the conversation we've just had for the last hour, right? But when we look at other things, there seems to be and this has been a focal point, and I kind of started with this earlier, that, in studying altitude and hypoxia, what we're starting to see are some, I might sneeze here in a second, which is what I'm doing. There's a lot of literature around hypoxia, namely intermittent hypoxia. I've studied hypoxia for about 15 years and developed protocols around it to get people more adaptive to this response that we tend to see with this, that creates a better immune system response due to every cell's ability to detect hypoxia. And that comes with certain gene expressions and responses to the system. And we're seeing this right now with COVID, big time. As I'm starting to use some of these protocols, as research is starting to finally start to come out on this, not just with COVID, but you will see, I can guarantee, I'm in conversations right now with some very interesting things around this, to where the focus is going to go towards hypoxia and intermittent hypoxia due to the recovery aspects that it employs. Recovery simply meaning is a global thing, how the system comes back to homeostasis, and the immune system sits inside of that response. It's not the answer to things by any stretch of it, but I can tell you that you can create many Sherpa-like effects within inside any human experience. It's just to what degree and what protocols we're using within that. And so just to titrate this back down into something tangible, the basic way to get a hold of something like this and to express it would to induce some type of hypoxic training into one's regimen. That could be as basic as apnea training. That could step up into things like apnea training or hypoxic training with inside the training regimen, meaning we're doing some types of breath hold to exacerbate some dynamic hypoxia into the training, which we know can express EPO in ways that is like major, but it takes some time for adaptation. You don't necessarily need machines, but if you just so happen to want to invest in a hypoxic simulator or machine, you could therefore start to express these things in ways that changes not only how we physiologically make changes to performance, but recovery and immune system. And we're seeing this across the boards. It's not about COVID. It's not about immune system. It's about the whole totality of it. Like, I'll cite research all the time. I cite a study on panic disorders all the time, where they looked at people who have panic attacks. And it's interesting that the signs and symptoms show up an hour or more before a panic attack happens. Then when the actual panic attack occurs, there's nothing physiologically wrong with the individual.
Wow.
The general public hears that, or people hear that, and they go, okay, well, so I don't have panic attacks. No, you're not hearing what I'm saying. What I'm really saying is that when you lose your shit, and we all lose our shit, there were signs long before that were happening that you didn't set boundaries or pay attention to, that have now allowed something else to become the focal point to where you blame. And that is just simply breaking down. You weren't in control of your of your responses, or setting your own boundaries to understand that. This is where a breath protocol training this is where a periodized program comes into play with a team, to where we can organize and set things to where people become because of the amount of breath work we are now applying to things, people go, holy shit, I'm mouth breathing right now. They become aware, right? Mm. They're like, I wonder why I'm mouth breathing. Oh, because I'm driving around in my car like an idiot, trying to get somewhere really and not paying attention to what's going on, versus calmly driving to get where I'm going. because being in a rush just drained some energy and put me into this heightened arousal state. And now I'm reacting when I get there, right? Like it's all connected. And the problem is that we don't have people who have learned how to connect the dots enough to this, but breathing becomes that foundation, because once we've hardwired how to actually pay attention to the patterns to get you back to what is real normal breathing, you then become aware of dysfunctional breathing instantaneously in yourself. And you start to see it everywhere. I watched a bunch of runners the other day at the beach. I went surfing and I was sitting there like getting changed. And there must have been 20 or 30 runners that came running by, all at a very slow pace. Every one of them was mouth breathing. For what? Because that's all they know. And they're metabolically, they're not doing themselves a service. They're just getting something done that they think they need to get done in order to feel better about themselves, versus really understanding, why can't I just feel better about myself regardless of doing this or not? Like, and how about I go out and do this and learn what this does for me and retrain this system and become more physiologically capable of things. It's very interesting to watch once you start to really implement this stuff, because you start to see it everywhere.
No, there's some incredible information there. I really appreciate that, Brian. And I know as well, that's just scratching the surface on some of this as well.
I hope it's not too deep. I hope it's not too deep, too philosophical, but the fact is you can't have this approach. This is actually like philosophy should be at the foundation of every organization or person's life. That's my opinion, but that is what should be at the, this is why organizations have like vision statements and mission statements and things. Those fundamental philosophies of what these things stand for. Well, what do you stand for? Now go out and let's implement the tools. Let's use the tools to keep us here, right? And breathing starts the fundamentals of those tools.
Well, just on that as well, though, a lot of coaches face a battle financially at clubs. I'm talking in the UK more than anywhere, about purchasing bits of equipment and things like that. And essentially, like you said at the very, very start, we're taking it back to the body. So if that's not an argument for adding some of this stuff in, then I don't know what is. But no, I think there's been some incredible information. I know you're putting new stuff out all the time, which is brilliant. So keep up the amazing work. I want to be really respectful of your time as well. Just before I let you go, I know you mentioned it before, the website, and I don't know if you mentioned your social media, but where would you send people to sort of keep up with what's going on?
shiftadapt.com. That's our website. And then there's a social media account. There's social media accounts for that. And then, I only use, I really only use Instagram. I just post information on there. I don't hang out. I don't get involved in anything really. And that's @ Brian Mackenzie. There's ways to get a hold of me through either one of those places, whether the website or the social media stuff. Reaching out to the organization if people want to. And then we have the Health and Human Performance Foundation, which is hhp-foundation.org, where we are studying a lot of this stuff and putting out research and sharing research that's coming out on all of this stuff all the time. So we're very invested in this and want to make sure that, the world gets as much of this in their focal as they can.
Yeah, we'll keep up the amazing work. And I thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome, Ben. Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.